I was 34 years old the day I walked into my brother's funeral wearing my uniform. A crisp navy jacket, gold buttons polished, badge secured over my heart. Not a wrinkle on me, not a tremble in my hand. But inside, I was 13 again, standing in front of my father with scraped knees and a trembling voice, saying I wanted to be a cop. I could still remember his face then, tight-jawed, disappointed, as if I'd confessed to a crime. He didn't shout. He never did. He just said, "That's not a job for a girl. Not in this family." And now, 21 years later, I stood tall in that uniform, stepping through the heavy church doors into a wall of silence. The moment I crossed the threshold, heads turned. Some in confusion, others in disapproval, but mostly indifference. Like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. I saw my mother first. She looked tired, thinner than I remembered. Her eyes passed over me without recognition. Then came the cousins, the aunts, the neighbors from the old block. No one spoke. No one waved. Even my Uncle Michael, who used to slip me candy at cookouts, looked through me like I wasn't real. And then I saw him. My father. He stood rigid beside the casket, his military medals gleaming against his blazer. He wore no tears, no grief, only discipline. When he saw me, something in his face shifted, a flicker of something I couldn't name. Then he turned his back. I sat in the last row, like an intruder, like someone crashing a stranger's funeral. The wooden pew was cold under me, the hymns echoing from the rafters like they belonged to another world. When the priest asked for memories, people stood and told stories of Brian, how he used to fix cars for free, how he made everyone laugh, how he was the golden one. I said nothing. The truth was, Brian was golden. But he was also troubled, quiet in a dangerous way. He carried secrets like they were weights stitched into his skin. I knew he drank. I suspected he was into things that didn't belong on paper. But I also knew he loved me, even when no one else in that room did. After the service, I walked slowly to the casket. His face was still, too still. Makeup covered the bruising around his jaw. His hands were folded, but they weren't his hands. They were props. His life had been taken and repackaged into a lie. "You shouldn't have come in that," my father said, voice low. "You dishonor the family wearing that thing here." That thing. As if my career, my entire life, was some shameful costume. I didn't answer him. I looked him dead in the eyes, nodded once, and turned away. Because I didn't wear that uniform for him. I wore it for Brian. I wore it because he once told me, after a long night in a diner parking lot, "If anything happens to me, I know you'll dig deeper. You always do." That sentence had haunted me ever since the call. Accident, they said. Lost control of the vehicle. But Brian didn't drive drunk. He hated highways. And the bruises, they weren't from airbags. I sat back down, still in full view of the coffin. I couldn't cry. Not yet. Not until I found out what really happened, because that day, something shifted inside me. Grief turned to suspicion. Mourning hardened into resolve. I wasn't just going to bury my brother. I was going to resurrect the truth he died holding, and I would do it wearing the badge he once said made him feel safe, even if it made the whole room go cold. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my uniform. It felt heavier than usual, not because of the material, but because of what it represented to them, to my father, to this family. I stood for a moment, looking at the funeral home's brick facade, the American flag gently moving in the wind above the front steps. I hadn't been inside yet, but I already knew what awaited me, not just grief, but judgment. And not the kind whispered quietly through prayers and morning tears, but the kind that burns through stares and silence. I took a breath and walked in. Instantly, heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. I caught the briefest glance of my aunt, who immediately turned back to her husband. My cousin froze as she passed me by. It wasn't that they didn't know me, it was that they did. They saw the badge on my chest and the neat navy blue lines of the uniform, and they saw a betrayal. Not just of family, but of something deeper, of tradition, of order, of their version of how things were supposed to be. My boots echoed down the hallway as I made my way toward the chapel. I didn't stop to greet anyone. I had nothing to say yet, and no one, it seemed, had anything to say to me. When I reached the double doors, I paused, fixing the pin on my chest one last time. I opened them slowly. The room was dim, the kind of warm, solemn lighting meant to soften the edges of grief. The casket was at the front, surrounded by white lilies and silver-framed photos of Brian, Brian smiling, Brian in high school, Brian at Mom's last birthday. There were no recent ones. No photos of the last year, no photos that hinted at the storm I now knew had been quietly building inside him. I walked down the aisle. Every step felt like a statement. I wasn't trying to make one, but wearing a police uniform in this room was one. The weight of eyes on my back only confirmed it. I saw my father sitting in the front pew, ramrod straight. Of course he'd sit there. Of course he'd claim the front row for himself, as if pain came in ranks. As I approached, he turned slightly, barely glancing over his shoulder. And then he said it, low enough that only I could hear, sharp enough to cut through bone, "You dishonor this family coming here like that." I stopped walking. For a second, I just stood there, processing the fact that at my brother's funeral, my father's concern wasn't grief, it was my uniform. The one I had worked for, fought for, endured years of doubt, double shifts, and his silence to earn. "I came to say goodbye," I answered. My voice wasn't angry. It wasn't soft either. Just steady. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I took the seat behind him, close enough to see the tremble in his clenched fist, far enough to keep my distance. The service hadn't started yet. People were still arriving, taking their places, murmuring their sadness in polite, rehearsed tones. I looked at the casket and wondered what Brian would think of all this. Of the stiff rituals. Of the fake tears. Of the way no one here knew what he'd been carrying. I wondered if he'd expected me to come. If he'd hoped I'd wear the uniform. I wanted to believe he had. I sat quietly for a while, trying not to think too much. Trying not to remember. But memory is cruel at funerals. It slips through the cracks of the ceremony and floods you without warning. I saw him in flashes, running through the house with a towel tied around his neck like a cape, tapping my shoulder at 2 a.m. when he had a nightmare, holding my hand too tight the day we buried Mom. I remembered the way he smiled when I got accepted into the academy. The way he said "You're braver than all of them" under his breath when Dad stormed out of the room that day. And I remembered our last phone call. The way his voice had cracked when he said, "There's stuff I wish I could say, but it's not safe. Not yet." I thought he was being dramatic. I told him to get some rest. I said I'd call back. I never did. And now he was in a casket, and I was in a room full of people who couldn't even look me in the eye. The priest entered and people began to settle. A somber hush swept over the room. I saw my father straighten even more, as if posture could suppress guilt. The priest began speaking generic words about life, about loss, about the unknowable ways of God. But I barely heard him. My attention kept drifting back to the casket, to Brian, to the bruises I thought I saw at the wake, to the way no one wanted to answer questions about the night of the accident. I had read the report. It was clean, too clean, like someone had already scrubbed the story. But I wasn't ready to say anything. Not yet. Not until I knew for sure. As the priest invited people to share memories, I watched as one by one, familiar faces stood to speak. They told stories that felt like fairy tales. Polished, harmless, shallow. They talked about Brian as if he were still a teenager, as if he had never grown up, never struggled, never asked questions that made people uncomfortable. No one mentioned the years he spent trying to prove something. No one mentioned how he stopped talking to most of them months ago. And no one mentioned how scared he'd sounded in that last message he left me. "They think I don't know what I saw," he had said. But I wrote it down, just in case. I swallowed hard. I didn't speak. Not today. Not here. I wasn't ready. And this wasn't the moment. I would wait. Listen. Watch. And when the time came, I'd do what he couldn't. But for now, I sat in my uniform, surrounded by silence, carrying not just the weight of my own grief, but the suspicion that Brian's death was not an accident. And that someone in this room already knew that I didn't sleep that night. After the funeral, after the silence and stares and the barely concealed disdain from my father's eyes, I drove home and sat in the dark of my apartment, still in uniform, the badge heavy against my chest. I thought I'd cry, but nothing came. Just this hollow kind of ache that spread through my chest like smoke, for Brian, for everything I hadn't said, for every moment I hadn't taken seriously. I kept thinking about the body, about his face, his hands. They'd only allowed the coffin to be open for an hour during the private wake the day before, and even then, people kept their distance. But I walked close. I needed to. His face was pale, too pale, and his jaw looked wrong, set too tight. I told myself it was the embalming process, that I was seeing patterns where none existed. But my gut said otherwise. There was something off, something too still, too prepared. I hadn't told anyone, but I'd reviewed the autopsy report. I had access. Being a cop gives you certain doors, even when you're not supposed to open them. The report was short. Cause of death, blunt force trauma from a car accident. Died on impact. No drugs in the system. Nothing suspicious. But I knew how these reports could be sanitized. Especially when you knew the right people. Especially when someone wanted it clean. I stared at the report on my phone again that night, and zoomed in on the photo attached. The damage to the car didn't look proportional to the impact described. The glass was fractured on the wrong side. The driver's side had damage, yes, but it was shallow. Too shallow for the fatal neck trauma they claimed. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The next morning, I visited the precinct early, before the rush. I didn't want to run into too many people. I just needed access to the archived files, the scene photos. As I sat at the terminal and entered Brian's case number, I felt my heart racing, not because of fear, but because I knew something was there. I scrolled through the photos quickly at first, then slowly, carefully. One showed the car from above, with blood pooled at the base of the driver's seat. Another showed Brian's shirt, torn at the collar, almost like it had been pulled. The report didn't mention that. Then there was the dashboard cam footage, 30 seconds long. It had no audio, just the moment of the crash. The car veering slightly off the road and tapping a tree. A minor crash, not fatal. And yet, Brian didn't move afterward. No attempt to exit, no reaction, just stillness, like he was already gone before the impact. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes. This wasn't right. This wasn't a simple accident, and then I remembered the look. My father's look. When I approached the casket, when I stood beside him in uniform, there was a flicker in his eyes. Not just disapproval, not just shame, but fear. It was subtle, a slight widening, a glance that lingered too long on the badge. And when he whispered, "You dishonor this family," there was something underneath it. Panic. I thought I was imagining it, but now, staring at these images, I wasn't sure. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he always had. And maybe Brian had. Too, that evening, I went to Brian's apartment. I still had a spare key. It was quiet inside, untouched. His gym bag was by the door, a mug half full on the counter. His notebook was on the table, the kind he always carried around with sketches and scattered thoughts. I flipped through it slowly. Random notes, training routines, lyrics. Then, wedged between pages, a receipt from a diner near the edge of town, dated 2 days before his death. I almost dismissed it until I saw the note scribbled across the back in his handwriting. Meeting was tense. Don't trust him. If anything happens, check locker 42. My stomach dropped. Locker 42? Where? I called the gym he used to go to, the one near the academy. Told them I was a family member and needed to pick up some of his things. The manager agreed to meet me the next morning. That night, I barely slept again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brian's face. Not the peaceful version from the funeral, but the strained, alert face from our last meeting, when he told me, "There are things I can't tell you yet." I had shrugged it off. I had assumed it was drama. I should have known better. When I arrived at the gym, the front desk guy was already waiting. He handed me a bag with some of Brian's shoes and gear, but I asked about locker 42. He hesitated. That one's locked and rented under a different name. I flashed my badge and told him the truth. He eventually gave in. The lock was old, easy to snap open with bolt cutters. Inside, tucked beneath towels and an old sweatshirt, was an envelope sealed with black tape. My name written in Sharpie across the front. If something happens to me, read everything. And don't trust anyone, not even Dad. My hands were shaking. I didn't open it there. I needed privacy. I drove to the lake, sat on a bench, watched the water. Then slowly, carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside were pages torn from a notebook. His writing, sloppy, rushed, but unmistakable. Notes on meetings, lists of names, times, locations. Sketches of a house. A recurring reference to someone named M. A sentence that sent a chill down my spine. He said no one would believe me, that Dad would cover it up like last time. Last time? What the hell had happened before? I read everything twice. Then again. The pattern was clear. Brian had uncovered something. Something involving retired officers, money laundering, possibly drugs. And he had started asking questions. Questions that made people uncomfortable. Questions that got him followed, watched, silenced. And the more I read, the more it became obvious this wasn't just about Brian. This touched our family, our father, our Uncle Michael, who had left the force years ago without explanation. By the time the sun set, I knew one thing. I couldn't let it go. Whatever Brian had stumbled into, he had trusted me to find the rest. To finish what he started. And maybe, just maybe, to prove that his death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of mine. I drove straight home from the lake. The envelope still clutched in my hands like it might disappear if I let it go. The words written inside echoed in my head like an alarm I couldn't shut off. Don't trust anyone, not even Dad. I read that line at least 10 times, trying to convince myself it didn't mean what I knew it did. But I wasn't a little girl anymore. I wasn't someone who could afford to be blind out of comfort or denial. I was a cop. And more importantly now, I was Brian's only voice left. I spread everything out on the kitchen table, the pages from his notebook, the names, the addresses, the hand-drawn map of what looked like a suburban neighborhood. He'd underlined one house again and again. No number, just the shape, the corner lot, and the street name, Mercer Hollow Lane. I knew that name. Uncle Michael lived off Mercer Hollow. My father's brother. A man who disappeared from the force after a disagreement with internal affairs and who'd never really looked me in the eye at family gatherings. He used to ruffle Brian's hair when we were kids and say, "This one's got guts." He never said anything to me. Not once. My hands trembled as I took out my laptop and began cross-checking the names Brian had written. Some were obvious, officers, both retired and active, some tied to precincts across the state. Others were more obscure, a city contractor, a logistics manager at a shipping firm, a woman who ran a nonprofit that supposedly dealt with at-risk youth. But there were connections, shared addresses, shared donations, meetings recorded in the same coffee shop over and over again, weeks apart. Brian wasn't making it up. He'd been investigating something real, something dangerous, and he'd known it. One name stood out, Officer Lyle Timmons. Retired. Disappeared from the force in 2014, same year as Uncle Michael. Same precinct. Same supervisor. There were rumors about Timmons back then, whispers of extra favors, side jobs, a warehouse that caught fire under mysterious circumstances. But nothing stuck. Just one more name in a list of people who always seemed to walk away untouched. I stayed up all night building a timeline with Brian's notes. I used red thread and pins like some cliché detective, but it helped me visualize it all. At the center, always, was Brian. His gym visits had started increasing 6 months before his death. He'd signed up for a second location on the other side of town. Why? One of the notes in his envelope read, "Cameras off after 10 p.m. Was he meeting someone there? Hiding something? I knew I had to check the other gym. It was the only place left mentioned in his notes that I hadn't been to. It was almost sunrise when I got there. I sat in the parking lot for a while, watching the entrance, pretending to be casual. The early risers came in waves, the energy drink addicts, the bodybuilders, the tired nurses finishing night shifts. I waited until the place quieted down, then walked in. It smelled like rubber mats and bad cologne. The receptionist was a teenager who barely looked up when I asked if I could speak to the manager. I gave my badge number. He went to the back and returned a few minutes later with a man in his 50s, gray crew cut, wary eyes. I introduced myself. I'm Elena Ruiz. I'm looking into some personal matters regarding my brother Brian. He was a member here. The man's expression changed instantly. Brian Ruiz? I nodded. He looked around, then gestured for me to follow him. We stepped into his office, cramped and filled with paper files and dusty supplements. I didn't know he was your brother, he said. Nice kid. Always quiet, respectful. But I don't know. He got a little jumpy near the end. Jumpy how? Looking over his shoulder. Kept asking if the cameras in the back alley were functional. Once asked me if I ever saw black sedans parked outside. I leaned forward. Did you? He hesitated. A couple times. Thought it was weird. This isn't exactly the kind of place that attracts government cars, you know? I showed him a photo of the notes from Brian's envelope. Do you recognize any of these names? He scanned the list. One name made his eyes narrow. That one. He came here sometimes, said his name was Mike, didn't give a last name, always paid cash. Asked about late-night memberships. Mike. Uncle Michael, do you have security footage from the last 3 months? I asked. He gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. I wipe after 30 days, officer. Unless there's a reason not to. And no one gave me a reason. I thanked him and left. My stomach was turning, but not from fear, from clarity. It was all connected. Brian had followed a thread that led straight into a pit, and now I was holding the end of that thread back. At home, I dug through my old belongings, looking for something I hadn't touched in years, a family photo from a barbecue, maybe a decade ago. In the picture, Dad's hand is on Brian's shoulder, proud, firm. Uncle Michael is off to the side, arms crossed, wearing a forced smile. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned it over. On the back, written in childish handwriting, probably Brian's, it said, the last time it felt like a real family. That was before everything changed. Before Dad stopped looking us in the eye. Before Mom left. Before Brian got serious about boxing, about finding purpose. Before I ever put on a badge. I remembered a night, years ago, when I came home late and found Brian sitting in the kitchen, staring at nothing. He didn't even look up when I entered. You okay? I asked. He waited, then said quietly, there are things you don't know, Lena. I pressed, but he just shook his head. Not yet. And I let it go. God, I let it go. Now I couldn't. I carefully placed the envelope back into a new folder and locked it in my safe. I scanned copies of everything. I started a digital trail. If something happened to me, someone had to find it. I wasn't going to make the same mistake Brian made, going it alone. That night, I stared at the ceiling until sunrise. The face of my father haunted me, not the man I used to respect, but the man he'd become. Distant, controlled, possibly complicit. And maybe something worse. If Brian was right, if Michael had ties to all of this, then my father's silence wasn't just pride. It was guilt, and that meant the next step was the hardest one. I had to confront him, but not yet. First, I needed to understand exactly how deep this went. I needed to gather enough truth to crush any lie. For Brian. For what he tried to expose. For the version of myself that I had buried to keep the peace. I wasn't keeping the peace anymore. When I first opened Brian's notebook, it felt like reading someone else's life. His handwriting had changed. It was sharper, more controlled, like he was trying to keep pace with his thoughts. Every line seemed urgent. Every name underlined in red ink carried the weight of something unspoken. These weren't just notes. They were warnings. It was clear he had been chasing something big, bigger than himself, maybe even bigger than he knew how to handle. And now it was in my hands. There were over 50 names listed in total, each connected with a brief description. Some were cops, retired, active, disgraced. Others were civilians, local business owners, ex-military, private security contractors. And then there were the unplaceables, people with vague labels like courier or funds manager, with multiple question marks that suggested Brian didn't have confirmation but had suspicions. Some pages had maps. Others had organizational trees drawn out like spider webs. I started pinning everything to my wall, line by line, creating a mind map from his chaos. It felt like stepping into the last weeks of his life, like if I paid close enough attention, I might be able to hear his voice guiding me. At the center of the notebook, there were 4 names that had been boxed in together. Uncle Michael, Lyle Timmons, Captain Joseph Reed, retired chief of the precinct Brian used to train near. And a 4th name I didn't recognize, Darcy Lennox, female. No badge number listed. Just a note, Tuesday meetings. Always in gloves. Watches everything. Never speaks. That name haunted me. I cross-referenced every public database I had access to. Nothing. No criminal record. No professional licenses. No voter registration. Just an address. A P.O. box in a neighboring city. My gut told me she was the linchpin, or at least the one person Brian hadn't figured out before time ran out, but there was more than names. Brian had dates, lots of them. Every entry had a timestamp, like he was building a case. One entry from 5 months ago read, warehouse near Pier 17, 3 black SUVs. Unmarked. Plates covered. Michael was there. Shouted something about next. Shipment being delayed. Another, surveillance cameras disabled near 8th and Cottonwood. Coincides with narcotic seizure next day, info leak? These weren't random guesses. They were observations, cross-checked against public records, news reports, even neighborhood chatter. Brian had built an intelligence network from scratch. I don't know how he kept it hidden, or how no one caught on to what he was doing then. There was the final set of pages. Torn, crumpled, stained, almost illegible. It was where he stopped writing cleanly, where the fear bled through the paper. The last complete note read, "Can't trust Dad. Too close to Michael. May be compromised. Don't know how deep. Do not mention this to Elena unless absolutely necessary." That line nearly broke me. He was trying to protect me even then, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own silence to see what was happening. Too afraid to push him when he needed it. Most, that entry was dated 1 week before he died. The day after reading that, I requested access to internal police databases using my credentials. It wasn't entirely legal, but I needed answers. I checked every name against recent investigations. Nothing. Not a single person in Brian's notebook had been looked at in over 5 years. No red flags, no inquiries. Just ghosts in the system. That could mean one of 2 things: either they were clean, or someone was actively scrubbing their trails. I already knew which one I believed. Still, I needed confirmation. I called in a favor from a friend in the cybercrimes division, someone I trusted. She owed me for something I did years ago. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was trying to close something personal. She hesitated, but agreed. A week later, she handed me a flash drive at a diner with her eyes down the entire time. "Be careful," she said. That's when I knew I wasn't being paranoid. I was behind enemy lines. The files she gave me included financial data, call logs, and internal memos. The money trail was the most telling. Over 24 consulting payments traced back to shell companies, each one with an obscure board member name, always someone from Brian's list. The same companies made recurring donations to a political action committee with ties to our city's police union. They'd funneled nearly $2 million over 5 years. That's how you hide corruption, behind smiles, behind structure, behind layers that most people won't ever question, and right in the middle of it all was Michael Ruiz. My uncle. My father's brother. A man I grew up thinking was tough but loyal. Turns out he was tough because he knew he could be. He had the protection of silence, and the complacency of people like my dad. I finally understood why Dad had grown so distant. He either knew, or had chosen not to know. And Brian had threatened that balance. So he became a problem. I spent days tracing every thread Brian had left. I added my own now, names he didn't know, patterns he hadn't uncovered. But every time I went deeper, I felt like I was dragging my brother back into the light, piece by piece. It wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed someone to talk. I needed to flip one of them, but they were too insulated. No one would risk it. Not yet.so I made a copy of everything. One version for internal affairs. Another for the press, sealed and held by someone I trusted in case something happened to me. I also made a third version, encrypted, password locked, and hidden in a cloud account. Brian had started the work. I would finish it, but I wouldn't end up in a ditch like he did. I'd fight smart. One night, I sat in my car outside the precinct for hours. I watched as officers I once admired walked in and out. I wondered how many of them knew. How many of them would defend me if I went forward with this? Probably not many. Whistleblowers don't get parades. They get demoted, transferred, forgotten. But I didn't care anymore. I wasn't doing this for justice in the abstract. I was doing this for my brother. For the kid who used to sneak into my room after nightmares. For the man who chose the fight even knowing he was outnumbered. I opened my glove box and took out the notebook. I ran my fingers over his handwriting one last time before putting it back in my backpack. I didn't know where this would end, but I knew where it started, with the list of names that never reached the police. They would now. I still remember the sound of the wind that day. It wasn't loud, but it pressed against the windows in my apartment like it was trying to get in and say something before it was too late. That morning, Brian had texted me something short, just, "Can we meet?" No context, no emojis, nothing playful like he usually sent. I was finishing a long shift, 3 days back to back, emotionally drained after a domestic violence call the night before. I almost told him no, almost said, "Let's do next week." But something in me knew it wasn't the kind of question you answer later. So I told him to meet me at the old coffee shop by Franklin Square. Neutral ground. No questions. Just space for us to breathe. When he walked in, he looked thinner. Not in the physical sense, but like a man carrying too much. Like he hadn't slept. His eyes darted around the room before he even sat down. The Brian I knew was loud, magnetic, always the one cracking jokes or throwing his arm around someone's shoulder. This Brian kept looking over mine. When I teased him about it, "You're acting like someone's chasing you," he didn't laugh. He just said, "Maybe they are." And that's when I should have pressed. That's when I should have asked, "Who? Why? What are you not telling me?" But I didn't. I smiled, ordered 2 coffees, and tried to lighten the mood. Told him about a ridiculous case I was working on. He nodded, offered a few forced smiles, then pulled out a napkin and started drawing. I thought he was just fidgeting, being weirdly artsy. But now I know he was sketching a diagram. A flow. Connections. There were 3 circles at the top, several lines coming down like branches, and then 5 names at the bottom. He tapped the center one and said, "If anything ever happens to me, look here." I thought it was a joke. I really did. I said something like, "Stop being dramatic. You're not in a movie." And he just looked at me, and then he said it. "You trust people too easily, Elena. Even the ones closest to you." It hit me harder than I expected. It felt like an accusation, or maybe a warning. I asked if he was talking about Dad. He didn't answer directly, just changed the subject, said he had to go soon. But before he left, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small box. He pushed it across the table and said, "Don't open this until you really need to. You'll know when." I thought it was some stupid sentimental thing, maybe a letter, a joke, a prank. So I threw it into my glove compartment and didn't touch it again for weeks. We hugged before he left. His arms were tight. I remember him holding on longer than usual. I even joked, "You're acting like I'm shipping off to war." And he whispered in my ear, "No, I am." It didn't make sense. Not then. But now it echoes like prophecy. That was the last time I saw him alive, after the funeral. After the cold glances and the faked condolences, I went back to that box. I was shaking when I opened it. Inside was a flash drive, 2 photographs, and a torn notebook page. One photo was of Brian standing near a dark alley, another of a man I didn't recognize wearing a badge but not in uniform. On the back of the notebook page, in all caps, he had written, "He's not who he says he is. Ask Uncle Mike." That was it. No explanations. No instructions. Just a command and a hint that maybe the man I thought was just paranoid was actually 10 steps ahead of me. I remember driving through the city that night, flash drive in hand, just needing to move. I parked near the pier, the same one Brian mentioned in his notes. I sat there in silence, watching the water churn against the concrete. I was angry, not just at whoever did this to him, but at myself. Angry that I dismissed his fear as melodrama. Angry that I told myself not to worry because Brian always bounces back. Angry that I was a cop trained to read people, but failed to read my own brother. All the signs were there. The nervous calls that ended too quickly. The times he'd show up at my place and suddenly stop talking when I brought up Dad or Uncle Mike. The bruises on his knuckles he claimed were from boxing, though he hadn't trained in months. The shift in his energy, the careful way he started speaking, like he was trying not to be overheard. I chalked it up to burnout, to stress, to maybe a breakup I didn't know about. I never once thought it was because he was being hunted. The week after he died, I went back to that coffee shop. I sat in the same booth, ordered the same drinks, and stared at the napkin sketch he left behind. I carried it in my pocket like a talisman. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. In the bottom corner, barely visible, he had drawn a small triangle. Inside it were 3 letters, RLM. They didn't mean anything to me at first. But when I ran them through the database, cross-referencing property records, I found them. Ruiz Logistics Management. A shell company owned by, guess who, Michael Ruiz. Uncle Mike. My father's blood. And the company had been flagged before for tax irregularities but never formally investigated. The cases always got lost. I called my dad that night. Asked him point blank if he knew what Brian had been looking into. There was a long pause. Then he said, Brian was always too curious for his own good. That's when I knew. He wasn't just ignoring the truth. He was part of it. Maybe not directly, maybe not as deep as the others, but enough to stay quiet. Enough to let his own son dig 2 FAR. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every conversation I replayed in my mind, wondering what else I missed. The puzzle was already built. Brian had handed me the box. I just didn't have the courage to open it when he was still alive, and I would carry that shame with me, but I also knew something else. I wasn't going to let his work die with him. He tried to warn me, and I ignored it. But now, I hear him loud and clear. I didn't sleep for days after I found those letters, RLM, on the napkin. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, Brian was there again, sitting across from me in that booth, quietly begging me to understand something I had refused to see when it mattered. Ruiz Logistics Management. A company I'd never heard of until now, buried under generic ownership records, suspicious tax filings, and a network of small warehouses no one seemed to question. And yet, there it was, tied, indirectly but undeniably, to someone I'd grown up calling Uncle Mike. Michael Ruiz. Retired early from the force. Always laughing too loud. Always telling stories about the old days that conveniently skipped details. My father's younger brother. The one who always called Brian kid like it was a joke, and me girl like it was an insult. I started digging harder. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even document it in official notes. I knew better. Cops investigating other cops are already swimming against the current. When it's family, the water's poisoned. I used a burner laptop. I searched from public networks. I cross-referenced addresses from Brian's notebook, dug into city permits, trekking schedules, property records. It was like pulling threads from a sweater that refused to unravel, until one night it all came loose in a single email attachment. It was a scanned invoice, sent anonymously to a new account I'd set up. The subject line was blank. The sender's address was gibberish. But the document was real. It listed 5 shipments moving through a warehouse in West Allerton, flagged as medical supplies, but the weight columns didn't make sense. The signatures were blurred, except one. Clear as daylight, Michael Ruiz, supervisor of site operations. I sat there for 10 minutes just staring at the name. Not because it surprised me anymore, but because it hurt. Uncle Mike, the man who used to sneak me chocolate bars at family BBQs, who told me I should have been a nurse instead of joining the force, but said it with a wink. The man who had called me after Brian died and said, "Some things just happen, sweetheart. Don't tear yourself up over it." That call wasn't comfort. It was misdirection. I remembered the time, years ago, when Brian broke his wrist during training and Mike took him to a specialist off the record. No one questioned it. Now I wondered what else he handled off the record. I remembered the strange tension between him and Dad at Thanksgiving last year, a disagreement they thought no one noticed. I remembered how quiet they both became when I talked about taking a corruption case in internal affairs, and then it all connected, like a flash of lightning slicing through fog. Uncle Mike wasn't just a name on a list. He was the center. Brian knew. That's why he left me the evidence. That's why he said, "Ask Uncle Mike." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a map. The next day, I drove to the warehouse listed on the invoice. I wasn't stupid. I didn't go in. I parked across the street in an unmarked car and watched. For 6 hours. Men in uniforms I didn't recognize came and went. Trucks with no logos. No security cameras outside. I snapped pictures. Took note of license plates. Then, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I saw him. Uncle Mike. Same limp in his walk. Same stupid leather jacket. He walked out of the building like he owned it. Lit a cigarette. Laughed with one of the drivers. I watched him climb into a black SUV and drive off. I should have felt rage. But what I felt was betrayal. And something colder, resolve. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew the cost. Reporting him meant detonating the last shreds of family I had left. Dad would never speak to me again. Hell, he might even protect Mike. And if the department found out I was investigating this on my own, I'd be suspended, maybe worse. But Brian was dead, and I wasn't going to let that be the end of his story. I went home and opened the flash drive Brian had left me. I'd been too afraid to dig into it before. Now I was ready. Inside were folders, labeled by dates, each one a breadcrumb. Photos of ledgers, video recordings of meetings and parking lots, GPS screenshots, audio clips. One of them made me stop breathing. It was a recording. Mike's voice. "If he talks, we clean it up. No mess. No trail." Another voice. "You sure your brother's not gonna ask questions?" Mike again. "He's too old. He doesn't want trouble. He wants peace. I give him that. He stays out." That's when I knew. My dad had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. He hadn't just failed to protect Brian, he'd chosen silence. And silence had cost my brother his life. I spent the night printing, copying, cataloging. I created 3 separate evidence packages. One I kept. One I mailed to internal affairs. The last one I delivered in person to someone I trusted in the media. I didn't care about protocol anymore. If they wanted to take my badge for breaking chain of command, let them. At least they'd be taking it from someone who still remembered. Why we wear it. A week later, the first headlines dropped. Retired officer tied to illegal logistics network. No names yet, but the pictures were enough. I saw Dad's truck parked outside my apartment. He didn't knock, just sat there, then drove off. A day after that, my captain called me in. The air was thick. "You've started something big," he said. "You better be ready to finish it." But I already had. Because no matter what happened, next, hearings, media storms, broken holidays, I knew the truth. The name that connected everything wasn't just in my family. It was protected by it. And now, it was exposed. I stood at Brian's grave that night, the wind just as cold as the day he died. I placed my badge on the stone, just for a moment, and whispered, "I see it now, Brian. I see it all, and I won't stop." I waited 3 days before I called him. Not because I needed more evidence. At that point, I had enough to shake the very foundation of everything we were supposed to be as a family, but because I needed to be able to speak without screaming. I didn't want rage clouding what needed to be done. I wanted clarity. I wanted him to hear every syllable and know exactly what he had chosen to become. So I called and said, "I'm coming over." He didn't ask why, didn't ask when, just grunted and hung up. Typical, the house hadn't changed. Same gravel driveway that used to rattle my bike tires when I was 10. Same porch with chipped blue paint. Same dead flowers in the pot my mother once loved. And yet, everything felt different, as if the weight of what I carried had warped the air around me. I walked in without knocking. He was sitting in the recliner, beer in hand, TV on mute, eyes already narrowed like he knew what was coming. "You've been busy," he said. "I'm not here to chat," I replied. He didn't flinch. Just leaned forward and placed the beer on the table, right next to the photo of Brian in his academy uniform, the one I knew he kept dusted even though he pretended not to care about sentimentality. "I found the recordings," I began. Brian's notebook, the flash drive, the names, the warehouse. He looked at me for a long moment, then leaned back and exhaled. "You shouldn't have gone digging." That sentence, those words, I felt them crack through me like ice underfoot. Not a denial, not confusion, just disapproval. Like I had embarrassed the family name by daring to uncover the rot behind it. "You knew," I said. He rubbed his forehead, like a man tired of pretending. "I knew he was involved in something. I didn't know what." "Not exactly. Your uncle, he came to me," said. Brian was poking around, getting close to things he didn't understand. I stepped forward. "And instead of helping him, you chose to shut him up?" His jaw clenched. "I chose to keep this family from falling apart. I told him to back off, told him to let it go. And when he didn't answer right away, just looked down, picking at a crack in the armrest like it mattered more than the weight of what we were saying. Then, finally, I didn't know they were gonna do anything. But they did," I said. "And you let it happen." He slammed his hand on the armrest, louder than it needed to be. "Don't you dare put that on me. I didn't kill him. I didn't order anything. You think I wanted this?" I took a breath and steadied myself. "You may not have pulled the trigger, but your silence loaded the gun." That stopped him. He looked up at me, really looked, and for the first time in years, I saw something crack in his eyes. Not rage, not pride. Something closer to shame. Or maybe it was just the reflection of my own grief bouncing back at me. "I tried to protect him," he whispered. "No," I replied. "You tried to protect yourself, your image, your peace, your illusion of control. Brian trusted you, and you treated that trust like a weakness." We stood there in silence, just two people in a room full of ghosts. My mother, Brian, the man he used to be before the world taught him to obey before he questioned. And me, the daughter he raised to be strong, only to resent me when I became stronger than his lies. "You think this is easy for me?" he finally said. "To know my son died thinking I betrayed him?" "He didn't think it," I said. "He knew." He flinched, small, almost imperceptible. "But I saw it, felt it. And I didn't stop. I delivered the evidence," I continued. "To IA, to the press. The investigation's underway. And your brother's name is on everything." He stared at me. "You really think burning the family down will bring him back?" "No," I said. "But it might stop the next Brian from being buried in silence." He looked away then, as if the room had become too bright. As if my presence, my voice, my uniform, everything I was, suddenly became unbearable. "You're not my daughter anymore," he muttered. "I was never yours to claim," I replied. "Not after you chose him over us." I walked out without waiting for more. I didn't need drama. I didn't need last words. The truth had been spoken, and there was nothing left to build on. The house that raised me had finally collapsed. Under the weight of everything it had refused to face, that night, I sat alone in my apartment. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just listened to the quiet, to the echoes of things I would never be able to fix. But I also felt something else. The beginning of release. Not peace. Not yet. But something cleaner than rage. In confronting my father, I hadn't just exposed the truth to him, I had reclaimed myself. Not just as a cop. Not just as a sister, But as someone who refused to carry the sins of men who mistook silence for strength, the next day, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a photo, me and Brian, from years ago, arm in arm, at my academy graduation. On the back, a note in Brian's handwriting: "Don't let them rewrite the ending." "I won't, Brian." I promised. I wish I could say there was a single moment of courage. A sudden surge. One defining second when I decided I was going to take it all public. But the truth is quieter. It came in pieces, unfolding like a slow ache, one that had already been inside me long before Brian died. The moment I found his notebook, I knew there would be no turning back. But knowing something isn't the same as being ready for it. And for a long time, I wasn't. At first, I tried protocol. I filed the paperwork through internal affairs. Gave them everything. The list of names, the photographs, the recordings. Every whisper Brian had managed to write down before someone made sure he couldn't say another word. I waited for the wheels of justice to move, but all I got was silence. Polite. Controlled. Like a room of men nodding slowly while secretly deciding to bury it all. They called me in a week later. Not to act on the evidence, but to warn me. A commander I used to respect folded his hands across the table and said, "You've done your duty. But if you push further, you'll be compromising your future in this department." My future. As if I hadn't already watched what their silence did to my past, that was the moment I knew. Not decided, but knew. That everything I did from here on out, I would have to do alone. It started with the journalist. Her name was Dana Bishop. I found her through a story she'd written 2 years earlier about a training officer who'd been harassing female recruits. She got him fired. She'd been doxxed for it, threatened. But she never backed down. When I reached out, I didn't use my badge. I used my brother's name. We met in a quiet diner off Route 7, the kind with red booths and coffee that tastes like it's been simmering for years. She didn't bring a camera, just a notebook. And a voice recorder she kept in plain sight. I told her everything. About Brian. About my uncle. About the names. The corruption. The fear. And I gave her the files. "You understand," she said, "that if I run this, you'll lose more than your badge." I nodded. "I already have." The story ran 3 weeks later. Front page. Broken blue, a whistleblower inside the shield. My face wasn't pictured. But my words were everywhere. And so were Brian's. The backlash came fast. Not from the public, but from inside. My colleagues, the ones who used to nod at me in the hallway, suddenly stopped meeting my eyes. My patrol partner asked to be reassigned. One morning I found the word "traitor" keyed across my squad car. Internal affairs called again, this time to say I was being reevaluated for mental health leave. I laughed. Then I packed my locker. Quitting wasn't surrender. It was strategy. As long as I was inside, they could control me. Outside, I was free. That week, more messages came in. Anonymous tips. Names. Confirmations. A retired officer who admitted he'd seen money changing hands but had been told to shut up. A woman who said her son died in an overdose after trying to report his precinct's drug stash being recycled. The silence had cracked. Then came the letter from my uncle. A handwritten note, delivered without a return address. It read, "You've made things very messy, Elena. I hope you know what you're doing. You're not untouchable." I burned it. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't. Fear had already taken too much from me. My badge. My trust. My brother. I wouldn't let it claim the truth. Too, the mayor's office issued a statement saying the allegations were being taken seriously. A task force was under review. But no arrests. No resignations. Nothing real. But then Dana called. "You need to see this," she said. She sent me a video. A body cam leak. From a patrolman named Jesse Blake. It showed a warehouse. A deal. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, my Uncle Michael. Not in uniform, but clear enough. The timestamp matched one of Brian's notes exactly. It was the piece we needed. A second story ran. Bigger this time. Names, faces, footage. And this time, the silence shattered. Within days, 3 officers were placed on leave. 1 captain resigned for personal reasons. My uncle disappeared. No charges yet, but the investigation was now federal. But I walked by a precinct a week later, just to feel what it was like to be invisible there. A young officer I didn't know stepped outside and said, "Hey, you're the sister, right?" I nodded. He looked down, then said, he would have been proud. "Not many people would have done what you did." I didn't cry then. Not until I got home. Because it wasn't about praise. It was about knowing that the world Brian tried to change might still change, because I didn't let him vanish quietly. I think about my father sometimes. I don't know if he reads the news. I don't know if he blames me, but I no longer care. He chose silence. I chose truth, and now the world has to live with it. I go to Brian's grave often. I bring the same coffee he liked. I sit by the headstone and I talk, not out loud, but with all the parts of me he helped build. I tell him what's happened, who's been exposed, who's still hiding, and every time I whisper the same promise: I didn't stop. I won't stop. Because justice isn't always about courtrooms and verdicts. Sometimes, it's about being the one voice that keeps echoing long after everyone else goes quiet, and Brian's voice is still here. In every page he wrote. In every name he listed. In me. We're not done. Not yet. I went back to the cemetery 1 month after the funeral. Not in uniform. Not with a camera or a press badge. Just me, my coat, a small bouquet of marigolds, and a folded note I'd written the night before but didn't know if I would leave behind. It was early, the kind of early where the sky is still unsure if it wants to be morning or remain in morning. I parked 3 spaces away from where I had on the day we buried him, but I took the same path down the gravel trail, heels crunching softly, each step a heartbeat I could feel in my teeth. Brian's headstone was simple. I had chosen it myself. Granite, gray, with his name and nothing else beneath it except the words, "He told the truth, even when no one listened." It was a quote from something he'd scribbled in the back of a book once, a battered novel he used to read when the world got too loud. I remember finding that line the night after we buried him, when I was still sleeping 3 hours at a time and waking up in sweat-soaked guilt, dreaming that he had called for me but I hadn't picked up. The night terrors didn't stop after the headlines. If anything, they got worse. People think exposing corruption is some sort of victory march. That once the truth is out, you get this rush of pride, or at least vindication. But they don't tell you about the nights when you wake up and check your locks twice. When you feel the gaze of people who used to be allies, now afraid to speak your name in public. Or the sick, twisted part of you that wonders, just briefly, if it would have been easier to pretend none of it existed. That Brian died the way they said he did. That the notebook wasn't real. That the rot didn't go as deep as it clearly does. But that morning, at his grave, I felt something shift. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the wind carried the last of autumn's chill, crisp and biting like the truth itself. I knelt down, placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, and laid the note on top. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. I remembered every word. Brian, I was late. But I'm here now. And I promise you this, they will never silence what you tried to say. I won't let them, even if I stand alone. Especially if I do. I sat there for hours. People passed, some staring, most not. A few recognized me, I could tell by the way they looked and then quickly looked away. That's fine. I didn't come for them. I came for him, and for me. Because somewhere between the shouting and the silence, I had lost the part of myself that used to believe being good was enough. That doing your job meant doing what you were told. But I wasn't that girl anymore. The daughter who used to crave her father's nod. The officer who used to think the badge was the only way to make a difference. No, that version of me died the same day Brian did. The Elena who sat at that grave, she wasn't fearless. But she had finally stopped letting fear make her decisions. As I stood to leave, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small pendant, shaped like a shield, placed just behind the stone. I picked it up. It was tarnished, old, but real. On the back were the initials JB, not Brian's, but his academy mentor's. A man who had retired quietly years ago. I'd forgotten he even existed. I didn't know if he'd been following the story, but somehow, he'd come, quietly, without fanfare. And he'd left something behind. It reminded me that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The next day, I received a letter. No return address, no signature. Just one sentence written in clean, block handwriting. Thank you for reminding us what the badge was supposed to mean. I cried for the first time in weeks, because I had buried my brother. But I had also buried the fear. The fear that no one would care. That his words would die with him. That standing up meant standing alone. And while yes, I had stood alone at times, there were others who had seen, who had heard, who were waiting for someone to speak first. I left the pendant on my desk. I didn't wear it. I didn't need to. I had my own weight now, my own truth, and I knew I would carry it until the end. There's no happy ending to this story. No dramatic courtroom finale. No tearful reconciliation with my father. He still hasn't called. And maybe he never will. But the silence no longer defines me. I found my voice in the echoes Brian left behind, and that's the part no one could bury.